Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Libby Book Club for WA. I'm your host, David Allen Patali, and I'm a West Australian author. My book, Locust Summer, came out a couple of years ago, and if you haven't read it, I'm very disappointed. Not really. But tonight is all about this book, How to Be Remembered. And our guest tonight is author Michael Thompson. Michael, welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA.
Hello, David. Thank you for having me.
Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. This is, of course, brought to us by the State Library of Western Australia and Overdrive Australia, combining their forces to promote the Libby app, promote reading, get people joining book clubs, get people joining libraries and reading a lot more. Now, How to Be Remembered is available on the Libby app with no holds. And if you've read it, congratulations. If you haven't and you're here, maybe just to see if you'll like it, please download the Libby app and get your copy. Now, tonight's format, we're going to have a big rambling chat. If you have a question at any stage, jump in the chat, type it out, and I'll read it for you. And Michael will answer it. Hopefully, that's
maybe. We'll see.
Now, also, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you tonight from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Now, Michael, have you ever been forgotten, or have you ever forgotten someone?
Yes and yes. That's a very good question. I have been forgotten many, many times, and I don't know what that says about me. But I when I worked in radio, I worked at the one kind of radio station and network for about 11 years, and there was one. I don't know what it is about me. Maybe I blend into the background. I'm like a chameleon or something. And there was one colleague that I had worked with at that stage for probably 5 years, I think. And we saw each other every day. And she and finally one day she turned to me and she said, "Are you Tom?" I'm like, "No, I'm Michael." She goes, "Oh, that's right. Okay, cool. Yeah, great." The next day, we are in the lunchroom again, and she turns to me and she goes, "It's Tom, right?" I'm like, "Nope, still no. I'm that forgettable that I have been forgotten in 24 hours. And then about a week later, I pass her in the corridor and she's like, "Morning, Tom." I'm like, "Oh, I'm just going to have to go with Tom now." So yes, I have been forgotten, and I have forgotten kind of terrible with kind of faces and names and things. And so I suspect people assume that I have forgotten them at all times when really I'm just terrible at kind of placing where I've met someone. So a very kind of long rambling answer to your to your first question.
Well, it's that moment of awkwardness, I suppose, that you had personally, but in your novel, How to Be Remembered, your protagonist, Tommy, it's not awkward. It's actually quite a terrible thing. He's forgotten every year, almost like clockwork.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about How to Be Remembered? What's the story about, and where did the inspiration for it come from?
Yeah, sure. So it is about Tommy, who is a young man, and the start of the book basically starts from his first year of life, and every year on the same day, basically his birthday, everybody who knows him forgets that he exists. So that's his family, that's his friends, everyone. He's just basically wiped in their memories, and kind of all evidence of his existence is essentially kind of erased. And so the story is really about his efforts just to have a normal life, to kind of have relationships, to have a job, the things that kind of you or I would take entirely for granted, but that would be very, very difficult if every year on that same day, on the 5th of January for Tommy, everybody kind of forgets who he is and he has to start all over again. So yeah, I think your question then about kind of where the idea came from, where the inspiration came from, it was actually about kind of social media. And I was thinking about some of the stupid stuff that people post online that they probably would be uh, probably regret further down the track. So maybe it's photos they've posted on Instagram or something that they've tweeted, and they may well kind of live to regret it, and they might delete it. But I mean, it's your digital footprint. It still lives on somewhere in some capacity. And I was thinking about it one day, and like, oh, I bet there's plenty of people that would just love to be forgotten online. And I don't know how, but it just kind of the opposite kind of occurred to me, which was, what if there was someone who just wanted to be remembered? And that was all I wanted. And there was something external, something big that was preventing it from happening. And that was kind of where the idea came from. And I thought, okay, this has the potential for a really good kind of story. And I thought if that happened every year, then it would give you time to build up enough of a life in between. It would give you a chance to build relationships, and quite cruelly that they are then kind of snatched away annually, which actually sounds like it would be quite grim and quite depressing. But hopefully, and I believe it to be the case, that this is actually a book that's got plenty of hope in it, that it's meant to be kind of inspiring. It's about the power of resilience and kind of persevering and trying to overcome that. And really that in the end, it is about the power of those relationships and the hope that can come from that. Doesn't that all sound very fancy?
That's great. No, I agree. And your protagonist, Tommy, he really gets put through the ringer. You know, I heard a quote said of Stephen King's writing that he makes you care about his characters, and then he's very cruel to them. And then, and then they come out the other side. But well, maybe not most of the time. But with Tommy, what really struck me is that in the beginning, him being forgotten is a strange thing. It's an inconvenience. It's a confusing thing. But as he goes on in the book and you see these different iterations of him, it really starts to affect him. This is
Yeah.
it. He starts off quite young, then he, gets reasonably older, and we see it changing his worldview significantly. It's that ability to connect to another person, not just to talk to them, but to be remembered by them.
Yeah.
What's Tommy's journey in this book?
Yeah, I think you're right that when he is younger, it is an inconvenience. It's an oddity. It's kind of like that. If there's something that's unusual that's happening to you, but it's happened for as long as you can remember, then it no longer feels that unusual. So it's kind of all he's ever known. He's aware that it's not something that happens to anybody else, but he kind of just adapts and largely overcomes. And then really there is a point at which there is the kind of the why me element, which is during adolescence, which I think is probably the logical place where that kind of thing would happen anyway, because I think there's a lot of the why me questions asked anyway, kind of when you're 14, 15, 16, about whatever the problem is that might be in your life at that time. And then kind of, you're right, then it becomes a lot more meaningful. And particularly kind of when you are dealing with those things that, as I said, that we really kind of take for granted, the ability, the potential just to have a relationship, to have someone that you love that might love you back. And in this case, remember you as well, remember who you are from one year to the next. And so that is kind of when it does take on a greater significance. And I think kind of without kind of giving too much away, I think it kind of shows where that priority is for most of us, and probably should be for a lot of people, that the priority is kind of in those elements, those relationships that you build, as opposed to the kind of the material possessions that you might kind of collect. Because in Tommy's case, they're also kind of wiped. And I think there's the question that he kind of has to almost ask himself, is kind of what's more important to him, that he can maybe find a way to take along with him, the physical things that he's able to collect, or the relationships that he's been able to build.
There seems to be two exceptions to the rule in the book. One is a story that Tommy writes, the words, and also the prospect of love.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how did you sort of come to that decision to go, okay, no, maybe he can bend the rules here. Maybe there is that element of hope within the conundrum that he's constantly facing.
Yeah, because I think the key here is also this idea that we all have an impact on the people that are around us, and that you might only have a fleeting kind of encounter with somebody, and it might only be a few words, and it might mean nothing to you, but it might stick with that person for the rest of their life. And so you kind of almost want it to be a positive, lasting impression that you kind of have on people. And so I was kind of playing around, I think, with that idea that the impact that you can have on people can actually be kind of slightly slightly removed from you, that you might not, it might not mean much to you, but it means a lot to other people. And so I focused a lot in writing this on the logic behind it, and trying to just make sure that it was kind of watertight, that there was no kind of big gaps in it that you would be reading and going, well, this doesn't make any sense, this is rubbish. That kind of you go through, because I'm already asking you to suspend your disbelief in this, and just go along with the idea that, okay, every 5th of January every year, this poor kid is forgotten. And so I then wanted to actually make sure that as you're reading it, there weren't any of these kind of big logic gaps and plot holes that would be there. But there also needs to be these ideas that there is some hope and there is some capacity. And so to me, the logical part for that would be the impacts that Tommy can have on people that are removed from him. That if there is something that sweeps through and essentially removes the evidence of him from people's lives, so the memories that they have of him and his belongings and things, anything that kind of marks it as saying, hey, Tommy was here, that it's essentially that if it's a little bit kind of removed from him, or in some cases a long way removed from him, that can kind of get through, because it's not directly connected to him, but it still has an impact on other people. Did that make any sense?
No, definitely. Well, I see. Yeah, he because he saves people. He has impact on people within the story.
Yeah,
he never gets the credit because I will forget him.
Yeah,
but yeah, he finds ways to almost project himself.
Yeah, yeah.
A bit.
It also does require him to be a very, very optimistic person, which I think is. I don't mind that as well, because the one thing I did want to avoid was this being too depressing, because otherwise it really would be a very, very grim book. I mean, this is a boy at 12 months old. He's one on the night that he turns 1, his parents forget that he even exists. So they wake up kind of in the morning and or wake up during the night, and they've got this kid in their apartment, and they don't know who he is. So I mean, that would be a fairly kind of depressing concept, and that happens right at the start of the book. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are some people that get to kind of the end of the first chapter and go, well, this is grim, and they put it away. But it's not meant to be like that. I think then, in terms of kind of making him so optimistic and making him a character that you kind of want to root for, because he is a positive person and he is a resilient person, and he's one that does kind of bounce back relatively easily from a lot of things, because again, it's all he's known. And I think that probably if it had been something that kind of kicked in when he was 20 or 30 or something, then he'd probably be a lot more bitter. But when it's just all you've ever known, then I think your capacity to adjust and live with that would be greater. The other thing was that the setting of the dairy being the essentially the group home, the foster home where he lives as a child, was kind of really important, I think, for me, to make sure that it was a bit of a counterbalance to what were fairly kind of awful circumstances for his life and for the beginning of his life. And so I really wanted to steer well clear of any idea that upbringing in a group foster home is a terrible one, that it's not kind of a place with where there's any kind of abuse or anything, and that the character then of Miss Michelle, who is essentially the director of the dairy, the property where he grows up, is kind of, she's kindness personified. She is just meant to be someone who pretty much loves unconditionally and is able to accept him again and again, because by necessity it almost needed to be set in a place where it kind of made sense that kids would come and go, that someone who was there is there today wasn't there yesterday. And I mean, of course, he was there the previous day. They've just forgotten that he was there, but that it might be explainable, because I'm already asking you to suspend your disbelief. And I think anything else would have been kind of pushing it too much. So the setting of having it in essentially in a group home where there's kind of 11 other kids kind of allowed that to be the case. But I wanted to make sure that it wasn't like a Dickensian kind of kind of gruel for breakfast kind of thing, that it was actually a fairly happy place, and that his childhood, apart from the circumstances in which kind of he found himself that he has no control over, that apart from that, it's actually fairly happy.
No, I agree. And I love how you said, hey, Miss Michelle is kindness personified. She's one of
Yeah.
those people that just gives of herself. And it's such a great representation of, we often wonder, how do nurses do it? How do doctors keep doing it? Well, they are these people who are
Yeah.
caring.
And she deals with her own sadness, which happens kind of fairly early on in the book as well. But that exactly like the examples you gave, that they are people who just kind of keep on going because there's no alternative but to just keep on going and keep on giving of themselves. And so I think, yeah, she was quite an important character, not really to try and kind of make sure that the depressing nature or the grim nature of those circumstances didn't become overbearing in the book, and that you could still go and read the first few chapters and go, okay, there's some dark bits here, but there's a fair bit of positivity, and maybe it will end up okay. There's a long way to go before it kind of ends up with any kind of hope, but hey, at least there's some chances that it will actually end up that way.
I really enjoyed it, Michael. I read it a lot in the bath. I'm sorry to say, I didn't drop it, but
Are you a bath reader?
Sometimes, yeah.
I've never understood that, because it's so, like, it's so easy to get just every page would be wet.
You have a towel. You have a second towel. It's a big system. But anyway,
How long are your baths?
Oh, they're godly. They're luxuriant. It's the only time I'm away from the kids. No,
4 to 5 hours. Yes,
4 to 5 hours.
minimum. Yeah, goes from hot to ice cold while you're reading.
You top it up.
Oh, good.
But what I really enjoyed was you had a great review in The Guardian where they called it a heartfelt conceit. I thought that was a really nice way of summing it up, because it's not a trick that he gets forgotten. It's a plot point that comes back around again very naturally. It's not it's not on every page, and you get used to it's the characters telling the story, and it's not just an exploration of a circumstance, and almost forget about it, and then and then it starts to come back around. You're like, oh no, here we go again, and it's like building up a house of cards, and it's beautiful, and all of a sudden it has to go back down again, and you really feel for Tommy.
And I didn't want it to be too repetitive in the way, say, that Groundhog Day kind of gets very, very repetitive. And of course, there is going to be a repetitive nature because it is happening every year for him. But that it's not necessarily in exactly the same is not in the same place, is not doing the exact same thing, that it is just affecting wherever his life is up to at that point. Whereas kind of in Groundhog Day, it is just affecting that same day and is living that same day over. But he has to kind of pick up with his life and keep moving it forward from kind of wherever he is up to at that point. And I think readers who are also looking for more explanation as to why it is happening will probably be left wanting a little bit, because I really wanted to focus in this more on kind of how it impacts him as opposed to why he's been singled out for it. Because I think as soon as you start kind of focusing too much on the why is this happening, and kind of, was he born under a crescent moon or something like that, kind of, it gets very kind of supernatural and it gets very almost sci-fi. And I just didn't want to do that with this. I wanted it to be an exploration of his relationships and his friends and his family and all of these kinds of things, rather than focusing on the why is this happening, because I think that would have steered it into a different kind of book. And I also tried to be quite upfront about that throughout the book, and using almost that omniscient narrator kind of role of a character who is essentially narrating the book from the perspective of someone who sees all and who kind of sees everything that's kind of being thought by everyone who's in every scene, really. And in doing so, it allows you the freedom to say, it's never going to fix it. it's never going to fix itself. It's never going to necessarily have a happy ending, or there's not going to be this whole. I think one of the lines, I was about to say the lines that were used as though I didn't write it. The lines that I wrote in there was something about like the Hollywood ending. It wasn't going to be a Hollywood ending, I think it was, and where kind of all the memories come kind of flooding back. And I wanted to be really upfront about that constantly throughout the book, that so that people kind of didn't get to the end perhaps and go, well, you didn't answer everything about kind of why it all happened that way. I'm like, well, I was never going to, and I was kind of tried to make that clear along the way. I don't think you'll necessarily kind of satisfy everyone, which is something that I'm learning along the way, that you will never be able to satisfy everyone, particularly with a book that does probably leave a few little questions here and there, potentially some big questions here and there. But in the end, if you're able to satisfy most people, then I think that's going to have to do.
That's great, Michael. We've got quite a few questions in the chat. Thank you to everyone listening in and putting questions to Michael in the chat. We'll start at the top. Okay. So Kate says, great book. I really enjoyed it. I have 2 questions. Number 1, why was it that you chose a quick, neat ending after a big, complex build-up? And 2, why wasn't there some explanation or exploration into either why this happened to Tommy or discovering others like him? I think you dealt with that a little bit, but yeah. Yeah,
no, and the other point, Kate, was a good question about why it was such a quick, neat ending. Was really, I don't know whether the story had much more to play out, because I didn't want to explain everything. I didn't want it all then to kind of there was a big kind of build up towards, in those last kind of few chapters, there is a fairly kind of intense kind of build up, and I'm going to kind of tiptoe around it because I don't want to give anything away to anyone who hasn't read it or might be in the process of reading it. But I wanted that to end relatively quickly after that, because I think that's almost when I'm reading, I quite like that if you get to like this building to this big kind of climax, and then all of a sudden you've got another 5 kind of chapters as kind of things settle back down after it. I just wanted it to go, here it comes, big finale, finishes. But then I added the epilogue basically in order to give a little bit of context, answer a few questions, potentially, knowing, of course, that won't necessarily satisfy everybody. But the other point, though, that you made there, Kate, was about discovering others like him, which I think is just such a fascinating point. And I played around with that through the various kind of drafting kind of stages. But in the end, I think it was just best to kind of keep it just to him, because it would almost kind of become a little bit too big. And I almost wanted it just to feel as though he was being singled out, just him, that it wasn't like a condition that kind of dozens of other people around the world suffered, which was something that I was playing with. But I thought if it's just him, it makes it feel even more unfair, which makes me sound like a bully, and that I just wanted Tommy to suffer. I didn't. Actually, I think I did. Kind of what you said before, David, about Stephen King trying to make you love the characters and then kind of put them through some kind of torture. Yes. So yeah, I think I've answered all of that.
That was great. I was going to say as well, like you ask us to suspend our disbelief, but like halfway through, I started wondering, oh my God, who have I forgotten?
I know. Yeah.
Are there people out there? Maybe there's people out there who are like this, and
yeah,
like it started to creep into my mind. I was like,
it starts to hurt your head after a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's great.
Yeah, just this idea. Yeah.
And Melanie Penny says, how do you explain, these are the detail questions, how do you explain how Tommy remembers his full name and birth date on his 2nd and 3rd birthday to tell the staff at the dairy? Well,
I think I mentioned that when he was kind of approaching his 2nd birthday, his name, or just his first name, was one of the dozen words or so that he knew, that obviously that had been kind of used for him. And in terms of the birthday, Well, I think that was just kind of more of a general assumption that was going to be his birthday. In the same way that anyone who doesn't really know their birthday would probably pick one. And I think the day on which you start again every year would be a logical kind of day to pick.
It's like it sort of brings the point. It's like a superpower, but a terrible one. Because you've got
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a superpower you wouldn't want.
he's got all this knowledge built up about everyone around him, but
yeah, and it's almost kind of unfair, isn't it, to think like it goes into a bit of an advantage a lot of the time where he has this knowledge of everyone and they don't have any, and you think like it could actually work the other way, couldn't it? That it could actually be, and that was something else that I toyed with, that that there is so much you could do with this that is quite negative, that is quite dark, that it could almost be quite there's some criminal elements. And I played around with a few of those, but it didn't suit the character. It didn't suit Tommy. And so there was just that one little bit, that element where he played around with it a little bit when he was, what was it, 14, hitting 15? 15, I think he was. And where he realized basically that in just the same way as his name and everything is wiped, that his essentially his crimes, his sins would be forgotten, would be cleansed, kind of come the reset. And so, but in terms of kind of then having more fun with that and making him a bank robber or something, that could have been fun, but I just didn't think it would really fit the character of someone who is a genuinely good guy.
You remind me, I spoke in the first Libby book club for WA with Genevieve Gannon, her book, The Gifted Son, and she was saying, it's really difficult to write a positive story. Negative or darker stories, we tend to kind of know the shape of them, and they be challenging, but to write a positive story, a hopeful story, is also really difficult. Did you find it? You decided to go the other path.
Yeah, I think, you're kind of drawn to the negative stuff because it gives more conflict, and conflict is easier to write, and it's easier. Well, I think so. I think it gives you more kind of then more for people to react to. But in terms of then making the character very positive, the lead character positive and likable, I kind of didn't see any other way to do that. That if you were to make him kind of a nasty, I use the kind of supporting characters, the other characters, to do that, to provide the conflict. But yeah, it is probably, I hadn't really thought about that it is probably a little bit easier if you're writing something that's darker and a bit kind of got more of that negativity and more of that conflict. There's probably more to draw on. It's like kind of, God, this sounds so nerdy. It's like the Jedi versus Sith kind of thing, whereas the Sith have so much more to draw on compared to the Jedi. Anyway,
I'm there.
my true colors coming through there. Epic nerd.
Epic nerd. I'm with you. Look at my library. Come on, I'm with you on that.
That is a very cool boat, by the way.
It's the original America that won the America's Cup in the 1840s, I think it was.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Sorry, I digress. So on that point, Michael, Mike Smallman has a great question. He says, Tommy's journey is generally positive. There is one year where he deals with his personal depression when he slides backwards. However, he emerges in the following year with renewed optimism. This was a useful character development. Can you give us a bit of developmental background to this period?
Yeah, so I think it coincides with his stay in hospital, recovering from fairly extensive injuries. And obviously that's where he meets Josh. And I think that was kind of important. It was really important. It wasn't so much about the whole kind of, and part of it, this was mentioned in there, the fact that kind of Josh at that stage didn't know whether he was going to live or die. I think I can say without spoiling it too much that he does live, because he goes on to be a fairly major character. But that he gets almost more of an appreciation for what is out there, that this is his first time in a town, in a city, anywhere other than basically Upper Reach, where he's grown up. And so it's almost that even just getting out of town, even if that is to a hospital, and meeting someone else who has dreams and has goals that exist beyond essentially the town where he has lived and the dairy that he has kind of been living at since he was 1 year old. That that is kind of the inspiration, as opposed to this question of, oh, this is the point about it being a child who doesn't know whether he's going to live or die. That really the idea was that those words, I think, come and find me. That Josh says to him, and it's a throwaway line, but that is kind of the renewed optimism that kind of gets him through, because it's like anyone, once you have a goal, once you have something to kind of look forward to, it makes anything easier to get through. And the fact that he was then able to get through his last couple of years at school and kind of going back to the dairy, and that optimism is there because he knows now that there is something beyond that life that he has in that town where he's constantly forgotten. He's going to be constantly forgotten wherever he goes, but at least now he has an idea that there is more out there. And so I think that was kind of really kind of important for me for a character kind of perspective, in order to explain what is a fairly significant shift in his perspective, to go essentially from having 12 months of kind of depression, but really more of just wallowing in the misery that was his life at that stage. But suddenly he needed an event that was going to kind of snap him out of it, and then something to look forward to and something to build towards, that then kind of takes us through into the second half of the book. Was that, I don't know if that was kind of answering the question, I think.
I think so. Yeah, the developmental. I love that.
Excellent.
Now let's talk about love, Michael, because I want to read just briefly from the back here. So, on the same day every year, everyone around him forgets he exists, and he grows up enduring his own universal reset. That is, until something extraordinary happens. Tommy Llewellyn falls in love. Tell us about the love in this book.
The love, I mean, the thing is, when I sat down to write this, I had no idea where it was going to go. I do not, I am not a plotter. I don't kind of have a detailed plan. I didn't have any plan when I sat down to write this. And so I didn't even know if I was going to be able to. I kind of got to the first 1,000 words because my background is journalism, and it is kind of writing short form non-fictional. It's like about kind of state politics or federal politics, 200 words, and you cram as much meaning and as much information as you can into those 200 words. Whereas here it was suddenly going, okay, I'm going to have to write and see if I can stretch that out and like paint a picture and convey a story that doesn't exist. I'm not just relaying facts that are out there. I'm actually kind of trying to create essentially a world, even though it is our world, create a story within that. And so I think that was kind of when I sat down to write that, and I got through the first kind of 1,000 words and 10,000 words. I'm like, okay, this is all right, but where am I going? And it just and the logical progression of it was a love story, because if you are forgotten, I mean, sure, not being able to keep a job is going to be a bit of a pickle, but to not have anyone who is able to remember you, and when you love them, and they might love you, but then they stop loving you because they stop knowing who you are. I just think that is just perfectly cruel. And I thought that has got so much in it to explore. And so that's why I thought the love story is the key to the entire book. And I thought the fact that it's essentially kind of love that starts right kind of at the cusp of adulthood for him. So it's kind of a very early, it's the kind of one that leaves an impression. Like it's that first love, and he's a very sheltered kind of person. So it's probably the only kind of idea of love that he has. And so it was just something that I really wanted to explore how that would play out if you have this idea of someone that has loved someone from a distance for 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 years, 15 years, essentially, and the other person has no idea, A, that you love them, or B, who you are at all. I just thought that is just such a horrifically kind of sad prospect, but that it would be great to see how you would overcome that, if you can overcome that, and kind of how there is some hope to it. And so that's why essentially it is a story with where the love story plays such a major part in it. But I mean, then like in terms of relationships, the friendship element of it with Josh is probably the other big part, which is another kind of form of love, essentially, and that really goes back to those kind of key themes about the relationships that you build and the personal connections that you make, and their capacity and their ability to kind of endure. And so, yeah, I think that without knowing where I was going to end up, there was probably always going to end up with with really a strong kind of love story element going through it, because otherwise it would have just been quite kind of almost procedural, really, and just kind of saying, oh, well, this is how he kept his job, or this is how he lost his job, and blah, 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 blah. But really, the love part is the cruel part, but it also has the potential for the greatest kind of payoff.
That's a great answer, Michael, and I'm glad you went that way, because it's just got so much heart. I read it quickly, and you've also Fleur McDonald, who was speaking to me in the last edition, loved this book. She absolutely devoured it.
Oh, fantastic! That is wonderful to hear.
Let's flip to a bit of craft stuff, because Daniela has got a question for you. She says, "Thank you for writing such a brilliant book that was heartwarming and fun to read." Smiley face.
Excellent.
The storyline could have taken so many turns and tangents. It could have unraveled as it spanned so many years and possibilities. Did you have a method or a particular focus while writing to actively keep the story tight and succinct? Because you could have spun off.
Yeah, and realistically, you probably, I know I said before that it kind of felt like it had come to its natural end, but I mean, it does end with Tommy essentially in his mid-30s. Is kind of where it finishes off, and you could kind of keep going, and you could tell another 20 years of his life, and there would be all kinds of different things. But no, in the end, I needed to needed to end it somewhere, which is a very non-technical kind of approach. But in terms of the focus while writing was on making sure that love story was kind of explored fully. That if I was to go into anything else, I think that the love element of it and the relationship with kind of Carey, I would hope, again, without kind of any spoilers, that it leaves it in a place where most of your questions about that have been answered. And it feels like I was able to do that kind of over maybe kind of 2 chapters, or you could do it over another 10. Whereas I think it just, in terms of trying to keep the pace of the novel up as well, I didn't want it to keep dragging on and keep going on, because I'm also aware of the fact that it could get repetitive if you start going, because it's happening every year. At some point that would get a little bit repetitive, and I didn't want that to happen. I wanted you to finish the book going, I probably still have some questions, and probably could have read a little bit more of this, but I would rather that than you get to the end and go, gee, I wish that finished 5 chapters ago, before I kind of got bored of the whole concept of this reset that happened. So I think it's always a case of trying to leave them wanting more. And then in terms of the method to keep the story kind of tight, it was very chronological, I think, as well, that by necessity I was just telling the story of Tommy's life. Part of it, and this is very embarrassing, and I shouldn't admit this, but I'm going to, is I didn't know any other way to do it. I had never written a novel before. And so I had never kind of considered the idea of being more of kind of playing around with kind of various timelines and things. I just wanted to tell it chronologically. I thought there's going to be enough kind of to keep track of with the reset and who kind of remembers what and how he's kind of trying to make sure that these little bits and pieces are remembered, that I didn't want to try and confuse things when I was still trying to figure out how to write a book myself. And so that was kind of, that almost happened by necessity, that was part of the method to try and keep it tight and succinct.
That's a great answer, Michael. I like it. Yeah, just the process did it to you. Yeah.
It was me learning to write a novel. It was me trying to figure out whether I could actually do this, and to go, I'm going to tell this story in the most logical fashion that I can think of, which is chronologically. And when I feel that the story has reached a kind of a natural, not necessarily a natural end, but a natural point at which it can end, then that's going to do it. And I do feel like if I'd kept going, I would have just ended up opening a lot of other potential tangents. And I think that's probably when I would have been tempted to start exploring the potential for there being others out there. And that would have just led it into an entirely different place and probably not be the novel that it is now.
Well, it's the cheeky question, but any chance of a sequel?
I wouldn't rule it out, because I actually love the characters, and I love the actual idea, which actually sounds very kind of arrogant to say that. I love my own idea. But no, I actually kind of like the concept of it. And I feel like there is a lot to play with, whether that is kind of then exploring some of those darker elements and those other things that you could potentially kind of do with it, but that didn't suit Tommy. Wouldn't that be interesting to explore maybe that in a sequel, or the potential for there being other people out there? But at this stage, no. My second book, which I've finished, is not related to this at all. Similar kind of genre, which it probably doesn't actually tell you much, because it's almost a book that almost slips between genres a little bit. It's kind of general fiction / kind of speculative fiction, but you don't want it to sound too kind of sci-fi or too supernatural or anything. It's not those. But anyway, the second book is that same non-specific genre.
Excellent. Well, I've got a question that kind of segues to this, because so while you've got book number 2 bubbling away, getting it to a publication, Brian H says, has there been any interest in turning this, How to Be Remembered, into a film or television series?
Yes, indeed there has, which is very, very exciting. The film rights actually sold about 6 months before the book was published, which is very, very exciting. And that kind of played out by when the book was sold into the US, when the US kind of publishing deal was done, that was done for 2 books over there with the publisher Source Books. And when that was announced in the States, there was, I think, a bit of film interest. And so suddenly there were all these film producers and companies kind of pitching. And there I was just sitting on a Zoom call at my kind of writing desk, having conversations with producers of films that I have kind of watched for the last 20 years. And here they are kind of saying, this is what we would do. These are the changes that we would make. This is how we would see it kind of being converted and translated into a film, which was just fantastically exciting. And so that happened, probably when it was still almost at the kind of final draft stage. And so it's probably still, it's a long way to go from a book being optioned for film to actually being made into a film. But the company that we ended up going with is a fantastic one. So fingers crossed when more details of that are announced, that maybe one day we might see it on the big screen. That would just be fantastic.
That'd be amazing. And just on that point, Bill has a comment. It says, we like your idea too. So.
Excellent. Thank you. So,
You're
sorry.
going to be support here in the room, Michael.
So it's not too arrogant. Excellent.
No, no,
That's
no.
good to hear.
You gotta back yourself. You got to back yourself. And were they talking about an Australian setting, or like would they move it to the States? What would they change?
Well, that's actually a really good point, because it is an Australian book. It is set in Australia, but it is never actually declared to be in Australia. And the place names are not, they're not, I mean, it might be coincidentally sharing kind of place names, but it's not deliberately set anywhere in Australia. And the idea with that is it was designed to be, I wanted it to actually have international appeal. I was kind of working towards the end goal. My ultimate goal was to be published in Australia and in the US and elsewhere, which I know that that sounds, I figure you may as well kind of aim high.
Yep.
And so I thought that this is not necessarily a story that has to be tied to Australia, that I thought the themes in here are universal. I think this is something that actually everyone can identify with, this idea of wanting to leave a legacy, to actually be remembered, to think that the connections that you've built with the people around you are perhaps strong enough to actually kind of outlive you. That's universal. It doesn't matter kind of what country it's set in, or even what language it is in. And now it's kind of the translation rights have been sold for, it'll be in kind of German and Italian and Polish and Czech and Portuguese and things. And so, which I think is, it kind of says that really the themes in here are universal, and that they're really, it's some of the language probably that's and really it's probably just Sean, the character of Sean, whose language is particularly Australian, and that would be they're really the only things, as well as it being a hot Christmas, that actually set it in in Australia. So look, if there was a film, it could be set anywhere, and I honestly wouldn't mind.
Yeah. We've got another lovely question actually here from Mike Swan. He says, I was intrigued by the way the story is linked by constant characters. It is probably important that Tommy has forgotten every birthday, but it seems more important that he does not forget the people he meets in the course of living each year. So we end up with a way of developing other people's stories as Tommy's tale unfolds. That's a great observation, because there's no small characters here. They're all rounded. They've all got something to them, and Tommy really pays attention to them, and they all have an impact, don't they?
Yeah, and I think as well it kind of goes, that is a really good kind of point from Mike. There is an element as well to this, of this idea that some people are just meant to be kind of friends and meant to be kind of drawn together, and so that sure, obviously Tommy doesn't forget who they are. They forget who he is, but there is still something that kind of draws them together, as though they are essentially meant to be part of each other's lives. And I think that the best kind of comparison I can give to that would be kind of if you've ever had kind of like a school friend that you haven't seen for 20 years and you haven't spoken to them, and then you do kind of catch up, and within kind of 10 minutes you are talking and kind of laughing and carrying on as though you've never been apart. It's that kind of thing, that it's not a that some people are just essentially meant to be friends, and so in that way, or meant to kind of be part of each other's lives. And so I think that in that way you do kind of have these lives constantly kind of intersecting, for say Tommy, and for Josh, and for Carey then as well. And in doing so you develop Josh in particular. I would say Josh's story and his character develops, and probably would have developed vastly differently had it not been for Tommy's constant kind of presence in there, even though that is kind of being reset every 12 months.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I've just got one more question from the chat I'd like to put to you. So Linda says, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I love stories that are unusual and different and keep you guessing what's going to happen. She does ask at the end, have you written other books, or are you writing more books? But you've got number 2 fairly done. what else is bubbling away in your brain? I know you're quite a busy man. You're a podcaster, you're a business journalist. You've got all these plates that you're spinning over there in Sydney. Thank you for staying up late for us. But
no, not at all. Yeah, so there are a bunch of other books that I would like to write. There's that I've got a few more ideas because I love the idea of kind of grounded speculative fiction. So something like How to Be Remembered, where you are dealing with our world essentially and just tweaking one little element of it. And I think that's very kind of fertile ground for stories, because I don't know how on earth anybody writes a murder mystery or any kind of crime fiction now, because I just can't think of any kind of new suspect or any new kind of motive that hasn't already been kind of done. And it amazes me that every year there are so many new original kind of crime fiction books coming out. And so that's why
in the library. Hang on.
Yeah, I just don't understand it. How on earth kind of this kind of keeps happening, and there's like fresh takes every year. I'm like, this is just amazing. So I'm gonna stick to what I like, which is these ones, because you can kind of play around with things that are a little bit kind of out there. And I think for me, the key is trying to make it believable and trying to make it realistic and give it a grounding in reality, and go, yes, you need to suspend your disbelief on this, but I'm going to try and make it feel as real as possible so that you can actually kind of get into it. So I've got probably another, after the one that I've done now, and I'm just kind of working through the editing process with the publishers. There's another probably two other ones that I'm keen to write. And at the same time, we are kind of constantly putting out new podcasts, and it's just, excuse me, it is a daily thing. Where, like, Fear and Greed is our podcast, and it comes out every day. I think we have 29 episodes across kind of the week, so it's a fairly constant kind of production schedule. So it's about then just trying to find the time to write in and around all of these kind of bits and pieces. So it is a little bit challenging, but I mean, having How to Be Remembered out there and kind of seeing people reading it and having conversations like this where we are discussing this book is just the greatest thrill for me. And it just makes me go, this is all I want to do. I just want to keep on writing, because I've got kind of so many more ideas and more things I want to kind of play with. And if I can kind of keep doing that, then that would just be the ideal. And hey, if I kind of keep doing the podcast on the side, because I also like talking, then I'm going to be very, very happy indeed.
All power to you, Michael. What's it been like since the book came out? Have you seen people physically holding it in the street or on the train? Have you had that moment?
No, not yet. No, I do lurk kind of creepily near people. Anyone who's got a book, I'm kind of just like turning my head. I was like, oh no, not mine. Okay. And I have hovered around in our local library, because I found it the other day on the kind of the fast return kind of shelf, which was just a massive thrill for me. And I, again, this is a shameful admission, I hung around quite close to that shelf for some time, just watching to see if anyone would pick it up, and just wondering where's that threshold at which you can kind of then just go up to them and go,
you should read this.
I think that book's pretty good. And then then just go, and you know how I know? And I turn to the back page and I do that. It's such a shameful dream, that one, isn't it? And it's just so anyway, that if I could do that one day, that would be fantastic. And I suspect my wife would never speak to me again, because that would just be the epitome of kind of embarrassment, I suspect. And I would love to go into libraries and bookshops and to see it on the shelf was just, I hope the novelty and the thrill of that never wears off, because it is something that kind of I wanted for so long. I was longing to see it, and now going into it, I'm like, this is just amazing. And so, yeah, I haven't seen it being read in the in the wild yet, but one day, even if I have to kind of just hand it to someone or leave it on a train seat and then sit opposite and just kind of wait for someone to pick it up, even if they put it back down again, at least I'll see it for that fleeting moment while they did hold it in their hands and consider opening it.
Oh, why not? Well, look, it's going really well. It's everywhere. Everyone's talking about it. You've got a wonderfully supportive room here.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I just cry laughing at our little. I love that. And do you know how I know?
This guy.
This guy.
Look at this dreamboat. Like, oh, geez. I think that is the point at which I just go, you know what? I'm going to become a hermit now.
No.
Oh, I'm not allowed out in public.
We've got books to write.
Yeah.
We've got 5 minutes left. So if anybody listening in has absolutely anything to ask Michael, that would be great. I think we've got one last question that I've got in the chat. Let me see. I want to give everyone a Guernsey. For this, so Melanie Penny, this is quite a serious question. The character Richie teased us as being a potential major plot complication, but then he seemed to die out. What was the purpose of this character? How did the scene in which he took a baby Tommy outside contribute to the plot?
Okay, so Richie is an interesting one in that he was, again, without giving too much away, he was initially going to play a much bigger role. But, and I had toyed with the idea of it being him, again, I don't want to give too much away, who may have an encounter with a bus towards the end. And so, but then I realized that Richie is in fact a victim of this as well. And so Richie's kind of purpose was almost just to serve as a stooge. He was kind of like the patsy for the whole kind of thing. And so in the end, I didn't want him to be almost too sympathetic, that there was almost too much sympathy for him as a character. And I think if I had potentially killed him off, then what a miserable life he would have had, that he had, that it was a bit of an unpleasant child, but then he kind of, just because of his proximity to Tommy, and that he was just the purpose of him was as an unattached kind of loner who was able to be manipulated into those gaps that Tommy left in people's lives. And so really he was just meant essentially to kind of fade away, that he is just someone who's, unfortunately, he is the collateral damage for someone like Tommy who's getting kind of wiped. Getting wiped constantly. The scene where Richie took Tommy outside as a baby was designed to be partly just to establish him as someone who is just a fairly unpleasant kind of kid and who is that kind of loner, but also to set up the scene that then happens with John.
Yeah.
The somewhat fatal scene. I think you can have a somewhat fatal scene. It's either fatal or not fatal. So this one is definitely fatal. And to kind of establish the significant and just the fact that this is something that is so huge, and it only happened because Tommy was actually there, that if Richie hadn't taken him out there, then chances are John wouldn't have gone kind of tearing through the bush and would potentially still be alive. But that was something that was then able to be entirely rewritten by the reset, and just to show quite early on the power of what he was up against, that it could entirely wipe him out of something that essentially he had kind of caused inadvertently, that he had in a way contributed to the death of somebody, and that even that his involvement in that would be wiped. So yeah, he was kind of important. But yes, that he probably might have been looking for more kind of that kind of Hollywood kind of moment with him, potentially at the end. And maybe in another kind of version that there would have been that, but I didn't want him to be too much of a character for whom it was just too awful of a life, where he just went through kind of so much punishment and then still died. That would have been awful.
Well, on that note,
on that very, very, very pleasant and happy note, I wish there was a happier note on which I could finish. It's a book about hope. It actually is. After all of that, this is actually a very happy, very kind of positive book.
It's beautiful. I thoroughly enjoyed it, Michael. I think our chat really summed it up. We've laughed, we've cried, we've gone dark, we've gone light. We've gone all over. Julianne Tobin, who's from Overdrive, who's our rep, she's saying that there's, let's see, your stats are you've got 181 loans of the audiobook right now and 499 loans of the ebook through Libby in WA. So WA is going justice for this. You've got to come over and visit us or do a Zoom or something.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In a heartbeat. I used to go to Perth quite a bit because I was working in radio previously and and 6PR was part of the network. So I was in Perth quite a bit and I love WA.
Oh no, but Michael, I'll shout you a beer or two or whatever is your tipple.
Excellent. And I can tell you more depressing facts about the book and then try and undo it all by insisting that it is in fact a nice, happy book. Where everybody dies. No, everybody doesn't die if you haven't read this. It's not that kind of book. Michael, goodness me, it's time to wrap this up before I turn everybody off reading it.
I don't think that's possible, Michael. Michael Thompson, thank you for joining us tonight for the Libby Book Club for WA. His book is How to Be Remembered. If you've read it, great, read it again. Recommend it to a friend, pass it along. Next time, we're going to be having Joan Saunders' Echo Lake. So we're going into thriller, murder mystery kind of territory. But for now, I'm your host, David Allen Patali. This is the Libby Book Club for WA. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, David. I really, really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you. The book is How to Be Remembered. Please read. Thank you. See you next time. I think it just stops. I have to press end. All right, I'll see you later, Michael.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, if you ever come to the West, please look me up. That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely will do. No, that was really good fun. Thanks so much, David.
See you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.